All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are back on Sense Space for a really, really unique and first-time dialogue inquiring into all things UAP. I'm here with Matthew Green, veteran journalist, really a leading voice in the collective healing space, co-founder of Resonant Man with me, and wild shaman, philosopher, meta practitioner, Layman Pascal, dialing in with us to bring to bear some of his own insight and his contemplations on this, having held space and written on these questions over the last few years. So before we dive in, just really inviting a spirit of curiosity, exploration, and possibility from you, the listeners, as we try and figure out what the heck is going on, because there's definitely something going on. So, Matthew, I don't know where it feels right to start with this historical biography or what's happening right now.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you. I'm just noticing that this is a topic that I've very rarely spoken about in any public way, despite well over 10 years now of tracking this pretty closely as an observer, looking at it from the more conventional story of disclosure that you've referenced. We've obviously seen congressional investigations, whistleblowers coming forward, all kinds of incredible reports that, if we take them at face value, are absolutely paradigm shattering. And at the same time, it's as if the culture hasn't quite caught up. They're still seen as liminal. They're still marginalized. There's no way that we could say that where I'm sitting, we've integrated the idea that we may not be alone. Going further than that, that the US government, for example, has crashed a program to retrieve crashed craft, maybe in possession of alien bodies, biologics, as they're referred to in these circles. I mean, these are claims that have been presenced under oath in congressional investigations over the past few years. And of course, there was the landmark moment when the New York Times, back in 2017, published what's called this Tic Tac video, gun camera footage from F-18 Hornets flying off the USS Nimitz off the west coast of America, observing an object that was moving at speeds beyond any human craft and showing not only maneuverability, but an ability to anticipate where these planes were meeting. And anyone who's watched the testimony of the pilots and crew of those craft, I mean, if you sit and watch them speaking under oath to Congress, I find it impossible to imagine that there's not something here that needs a closer look. So we're in this moment, as far as I can see from a journalistic point of view, that this story is only going to build. And yet, as a culture, we're still very far from integrating the implications of this. And that is why I loved reading Layman's essay from last year that seemed to me to be a very serious-minded, although also playful attempt to begin to bring some sense-making to this.
Yeah, definitely love to weave in some of that ninth quadrant essay from Layman's Substack. And just presencing, Matthew, like as you begin, like the part of me that's holding space and representing the voice that is already, the people that are already kind of shutting down as they hear you present these basic, what can more or less be described as facts. You know, as far as we have a systems of checking facts, this is pretty close to like within the square box of a quantifiable fact. But even that has not really reached us and landed for the most part, or it sort of lands and then sort of runs off and disappears somewhere conveniently outside of the scope of everyday consciousness. So I wonder, Layman, if you can kind of help us understand why it's so difficult to reckon with this and what might be demanded of us what change might be brought about in our world if we were to be able to hold this.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of a thing because it seemed so long that it was the purview of UFO freaks and naive enthusiasts. And something's changed in the last few years where there's enough institutional acknowledgement and enough peripheral evidence that a lot of people are entering this discussion from a place of not having been believers or enthusiasts. But as they wade into it, they don't necessarily know what it is, what it means, or what's going on. And they join the rest of us in facing something that is not just the very simple question of, is there some other kind of physical life on some other planet that might have technology that maybe could get here? That's a very interesting question, and that might be part of this. But I think what people encounter as they start to explore these things is that the implications are much more far reaching about how we hold our worldviews, how we make sense of reality. Almost every aspect of this, if you probe into it or you start pulling on the threads, is half believable and half unbelievable, or challenges one of our basic assumptions of ontology. And we feel like, and one of the reasons I think why people reject this is not only out of ignorance or bias or out of a kind of almost physiological contraction where they need things to be very simple and realistic and materialist, although a lot of people have that. There's a sense in which people just don't know what to do with this material,
Mm.
that it's so strange and it challenges something fundamental about reality. And we're not always sure what that thing is that's being challenged. Right. So, yes, we need people to take this material more seriously and look into it. And yes, we need the data to be disclosed by various governments and military and even private groups that have been holding a lot of interesting data for a long time. We need to be looking at this in a way that's broader than just, Britain and America. There need to be an international exploration with scientists and with people from different specializations. But there's also a challenge to the way we do worldviews, the way we do philosophy. The kind of philosophy we need for this has to be intensely multi-perspectival. It has to be open to a kind of ontological plurality, right? One way or another, some other domains of the real are in play. It challenges fundamental questions about what is an entity, right? It really puts us up against the most basic definitions that we use to make our reality picture. And the thing that I think that's all a very reasonable position to take. The personal position that I take is that there are maybe a certain percentage of the population that's much more invited into these kinds of experiences by their neurogenetic typology, by their personal drives, right? The kind of people who have been interacting with encounters like this from time immemorial. And that we might need to reach out to these people or think about them as specialists. That if there is a kind of a leaking through of some kind of weird entities, weird experience, or the truly bizarre underlayer of reality, then we need people who are interested in and capable of handling that, who can be mature and nuanced and interested. Because for a lot of people, that sort of experience is extremely upsetting and extremely disturbing and could even put them into a sort of traumatic turbulence of some kind. So we need to look for the people who are best suited to be able to probe this in a resilient, playful, interested, and nuanced way.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you, Layman, like I'm thinking of all the stories I've heard of people who have had these incredible encounters, whether they're abductions or sightings of craft or even entities emerging out of craft. I mean, there was that incredible documentary made recently, The Aerial Phenomenon. I don't know if you've seen that, about the sighting that took place at a school in Zimbabwe. I think it was in the early 1990s. I think it was 94 or so. And by all accounts, 200 school children witnessed a saucer shaped craft landing on the edge of their school playing field and two beings emerging, which they all drew very consistent patterns. And then this film crew tracked down five of the children who'd been interviewed at the time by television crews and spoke to them in adulthood about this experience. And I defy anyone to watch that documentary and not recognize that whatever it was that these kids experienced was absolutely real. This was not a hallucination. This was not some kind of mass psychosis. Something happened, indisputably, in my view. And that's just one account of so many of these encounters that it feels to me like, and I'm looking for the language here, and maybe Layman, you can kind of help me to bring this into focus. It's something less about the reality of the phenomenon and more about our inability to integrate it into our existing frames that makes it so elusive.
Yeah, when I started thinking about this stuff as a child, I was really tuned into the work of the French information scientist Jacques Vallée, who
Yeah.
was one of the early collectors of these experiences, but also one of the early critics of the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Yeah.
And he has a bunch of fantastical ideas of his own. But what really impressed me about his work was tracing the similarity between these experiences and experiences in other epochs and in other cultures that might have been framed as angels or demons or holy miracles or elves or
Yeah.
leprechauns or
Yeah.
right as a
Fairies and
broader
jinn.
class of
Yeah.
experience here. And that may well be overlapping with something that could be technological and interstellar. We don't really know that, but there's a fundamental aspect to this that has been taking different forms, psychologically and culturally mediated different forms throughout history. And that's a really interesting aspect of this, right? We can easily imagine that there is some objective reality and people just perceive it a little differently based on their cultural image. Or we could imagine that it's somehow co enacted through the lenses and worldviews and paradigms that people bring into contact with it. Because those same sorts of we saw craft used to be we saw the Virgin Mary, or the Romans reported flying shields, and every culture we have on record has an opening to a class of anomalous entities that is diverse and which somehow undermines the basic distinctions we make between human and non-human, between technological and ecological, between interior and exterior and intersubjective. So one of my fascinations is trying to come to grips with something that might be transontological or transepistemological. Does it even make sense to ask about a type of phenomenon that might itself straddle or bypass the categories we use to make sense of reality?
Yeah. Yeah. And there may be many different phenomena, each of which sits in a different square on that chessboard that you've just opened up. And
yeah, I touched on that in the article a little bit, which is so Sean Espion Hargens was at this event that I ran last year, and he's a wonderful, very broad thinker. We had a little bit of friction around how inclusive are we going to be in analyzing this phenomenon, right? His feeling is that because so much of this information, so much of people's accounts have been not collected and have been dismissed, and because we don't quite know the orders of reality that might be involved, that we should be very open to collecting everything before we start to break it up. I'm a little bit more hesitant than that, right? I think we don't exactly know what this phenomenon is or how many types of phenomenon are involved, but it's very strange to think about a category that could involve physical crafts or could involve imaginal entities or could involve egregores and ideas and collective intelligence and supernatural beings. And you start to think, is this even a category at all? Are we talking about the same thing? It's very easy to have discussion and think, oh, the entities, or what is this phenomenon? And the this or the entities, we really over reify and oversimplify that to an enormous degree. Right. I
yeah,
think that at the very least, we need to be laying out a taxonomy of the different basic categories before we can even begin a discussion collectively.
yeah. And the other dimension of this experience, which isn't often present, is that they very often show up in connection with the dead. And that seems like a complete rupture, that there will be some connection between our perception of extraterrestrials and our own ancestors. Like, like if you want to really look at like how bizarre this territory starts to look, it's way more bizarre than even the idea that an advanced civilization has found ways to transcend light years of space and arrive on our planet in one piece. Like this is where the real fascination lies, but also where it all kind of starts to melt and become really difficult to navigate.
Yeah, if you look at the sort of classes of interpretation that people have applied to these experiences over the years, right? Could be real physical entities and technologies, could be the dead, could be us from the future, could be supernatural entities, could be multidimensional entities, could be aspects of the biosphere that we haven't clearly thought about and encountered, could be the remnants in some form of a previous civilization on this planet. Right, there's any number of different categories, but the really interesting question, once we lay out that spread of categories, is to ask ourselves something like, what is it that might be able to be interpreted in all of those different ways? Like, what
Mm,
would it be such that it could appear that way and make sense to be interpreted in all those different fashions?
mm. I mean, I guess like I'm thinking about this now in terms of my own, like where I've arrived at in my own understanding. And I almost hesitate to say this, but it seems very likely to me that it is true that there is a crash retrieval program. It is true that there is some kind of intelligence, a non-human intelligence that is interacting with Earth, or maybe intelligences that are interacting with Earth, that there is uh, what we would call a cover up. And there has been for decades, perhaps, well, certainly back to World War II and maybe even back to the 1930s. Like that is the consistent narrative that has become reinforced by more and more accounts from credible sources who have worked at the highest levels of the US security establishment. Like that just like, and I'm looking at this now as a journalist, like I can buy that story. It doesn't seem actually that fantastical to me anymore to imagine that this is actually the narrative. It doesn't, in some ways, almost surprise me that we haven't been able to integrate this. That it could be that it's just waiting to break through in some. And of course, this is the trap in a way of the disclosure narrative, is that there's a community of people tracking this who are just waiting for the day when the government makes the announcement that, yes, it's all true. We're not alone. We are in contact with these beings, whether it's through their craft or in some more formal arrangement. But like, to me, it seems perfectly possible that they're actually right. And whether or not disclosure ever comes from some central source is maybe almost secondary to the wider question of what does it mean for us to embrace an experience or a relationship with this phenomena at a more grassroots level, a little bit like you did on that in that conclave you held in the Pacific Northwest. But I just want to kind of presence that, yeah, I kind of believe that story. And I may be proven wrong, but I'm not really on the fence there. Like I'm pretty persuaded that this is a real thing.
Yeah, that's where I am too. I mean, the it's important to maintain uh, a general critical attitude, right? We
Yeah.
don't really know about any of these things. Of course, there's tons of stuff in reality we just accept. I don't really know about black holes either. But I
Mm-hmm.
used to place this kind of phenomenon in a separate and more spurious kind of a category, and now it seems like a more sort of obvious and legit form of investigation. I think we've seen enough pieces and there's enough experts suggesting that there's something there that it would be astonishing for it to be either just an elaborate hoax by
Yeah.
the government or all of these people are deluded. Now, there
Yeah.
is, of course, this element of, like you were mentioning, the people who have a kind of almost naive religious attitude toward disclosure, like it's the same as Jesus is going to come back and make it
Yeah.
all right. One day they'll
Yeah.
release the
Everything
files
will
and
be
the aliens will
clarified
land.
in a kind of blinding flash
Yeah.
of revelation. Yeah. Yeah.
And that used to be kind of that was the deadlock. Was it like you
Mm.
sort of side with those people or you dismiss those people? I think we've gone beyond that deadlock now. But the question is still, what is there to be disclosed? Right? Is it something where there is uh, some kind of physical technology, physical beings that we might have perceived, but for some reason in a bunch of strange multidimensional ways? Is there a strange multidimensionality to it? And in addition, some real crafts and real bodies and real tech?
Mm.
Or is it something where there's a very peculiar form of reality that we haven't really tracked very well in our civilization that can extrude itself partially or wholly into physical manifestations of various kinds? I think we
Yeah.
don't know what that one is. It's not too difficult to think that if there was technology there, that governments who thought they could access that technology would exert a proprietorial um, cloak of non-information around that, right? They
Yeah.
wouldn't want others. They would want to exceed their rivals in the ability to use these tools. But I think it's also interesting if we think about what it would be like for governments and intelligence services and the military to encounter something that was on the order of the kind of shamanic strangeness that has been
Yeah.
documented throughout human history, right? And in that case, I'm very sympathetic to the instinct to try to suppress some of this until you can figure out what it is. But it might be something that, by its very nature, you can't figure out what it is.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point you're making, because there is this narrative in the push for disclosure that we have a right to know, and that, this is the greatest secret that will change the destiny of mankind once it's been fully made transparent and released. But at the same time, like, we don't know what we don't know. I can absolutely recognize why, if you're running security establishment and you're contending with this reality bending phenomenon that you don't understand, that has maybe some very threatening characteristics as well as all kinds of other characteristics, you could really, from a good faith position, decide that this is not absolutely something that we're going to announce on the 10 o'clock news. So I think there's a kind of naivety sometimes that creeps into the narrative around government transparency on this issue, because I think there could be some very good reasons why this has been kept from the public, at least in the past. And then a kind of institutional inertia develops around that. And then we arrive at a deadlock. And
Well,
with a
philosophically and
yeah.
morally, I agree with that completely, which is to say, I think even though we can't just say that everyone has an equally valid position,
Mm.
a lot of the problems in doing collective sense making around this topic are because people take a side and then they rule out the validity of a huge number of other people, right? So
Mm.
we can rule out the validity of all kinds of people who have reported these experiences, and we can rule out the validity of people who've been bringing data and evidence forward. We can also rule out the validity of people who've been constraining this information. But
Mm.
I think if we want to collectively do a better job of figuring out what this is, we have to start sort of onboarding the perspectives of these
Yeah.
large groups, right? That there's something valid to the experiencers and there's something valid to the people who've been trying to keep this under wraps.
Well, I think you make a really, really powerful point there. And it's really it's kind of coming into my mind to really build a bridge here with the kind of collective trauma integration work that I'm engaged with, which very much is about creating coherent containers where multiple perspectives, and often like very different perspectives around perpetration, victimhood, around historical injustice, are brought into the same space. And perhaps we could use some of the tools and protocols that make that work really effective and powerful in this topic. And it feels like you were beginning to move in that direction, or even going quite far in that direction with your gathering last year in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of integral gathering around UAP. But I wonder if we could imagine some other format, because there's the format of the congressional investigation or hearing, which is of course freighted with political theater and all kinds of other interests at play, the kind of media circus that surrounds it, and the kind of adversarial conditions in which the investigation takes place. But maybe there's a scope for some other kind of gathering, which would be maybe held privately, but bringing together many different actors from this space that could actually generate a perspective that just isn't available in those more conventional institutional settings, in the kind of theater that we've seen performed for decades now, because this isn't a new inquiry. I mean, there were flying saucers spotted flying over the Capitol in the 1950s, right? I mean, there was UFO flaps in Los Angeles in the 40s. I mean, the first crash retrieval report goes back to Italy in the 1930s. So, we can sometimes be in danger of forgetting that we're speaking out in the shadow of a very long lineage already.
Yeah, and that lineage includes a lot of moments where it seemed like there was institutional acknowledgement and bits of evidence coming forward from military and intelligence and governmental sources. So we don't want to be too excited about this idea that the tide is changing, even though there might be some good reasons to think that. We've gone in and out. And I think people who are interested in this theme know that experience very well. You go in and out of your fascination with it. There's a tremendous
I'm
role
still
to be
in.
played. Yeah.
I never come out. Yeah. But I know what you mean. Like, yeah, I first became obsessed by this topic as a teenager. I remember reading, I think it was Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret. I think I can remember going on holiday and I was going through the X-ray in the airport, and one of the security guards kind of pulled this book out and gave me like a funny look. And I was probably like 12 or 13 or something. But it's funny, they say that sometimes the interest that you have, like in sort of childhood, teenage years, return in later life, where they really tap you on the shoulder. And that's definitely been my experience in the last decade. Like it's become a really steady drumbeat in the background, but one that has never left me.
If I can interject here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to observe that, like, in speaking into this terrain, Matthew, and then also sort of hearkening towards this new context of sense making, I also feel you're presenting something about a new understanding of what it means to be a journalist also, because journalism obviously has this ethic and virtue of pursuit of truth at all costs, really, like truth even if it doesn't fit with what you already thought was true. And yet even that notion of journalism has existed in a kind of bracketed domain of reality. And like it doesn't necessarily yet account for like what does it mean to be a journalist and go into a metaphysically altering experience and then try and give account of that. And just last night I ended up in a big long conversation, really in the same vein of the sense that there's an evolution in sense making, there's an evolution in what journalism is at hand right now, which is very important to allow a context where this kind of knowledge or multi-perspectival thinking can be held. My way into this is mostly, I think, as a point of recognition that our culture is built extensively on Christianity, and Christianity hides in plain sight as a fairly conventional and normative phenomenon, but is actually really quite freaky, strange, and alien-like once you approach it with fresh eyes. And so I can actually recall going for a hike in Germany, in the German countryside years ago. I hiked with a microdose of mushrooms and my ex, and we went to hike to a little village and visit a church on the top of the village. It was an exquisite church, and I went down into the crypt, and there I found a wooden carved figurine of a person with angelic wings. And it was the first time I had really perceived that statue without the kind of just like givenness of like, yes, angels this thing that's always here. I've never seen one, but it's just a given part of the mythos of reality. And there are so many other features in that story, notions of ascension, notions of like physical bodies kind of like giving way and dissolving into non-dimensional planes, i.e. the bodies going into heaven and so on and so forth. But this is, you know, all the serious people, all the presidents and prime ministers come and they, you know, celebrate Christmas and honor these Christian holidays, but they're honoring a mythic structure which contains all of this wild stuff within it. And then at the same time, the recognition for me that indigenous peoples, especially the Shipibo keepers of ayahuasca, like hold what could very basically be described as alien technologies. Like extremely beyond the pale, extremely advanced technology that really calls into question all of our categories of knowing in a similar and distinct way. So wanted to just bring that in as my foundational starting point here. And I wonder somehow if a recognition of the weirdness of the cultural foundation we already stand on can allow us to then begin to see like, oh, okay, it's not this new thing to be entertaining utterly wild phenomena as being sort of at the heart of what organizes our reality and has it make sense, because that's how our culture's been operating for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly, I'm really glad you picked up on the role or even limits of journalism in this domain. It makes me laugh because I'm in this kind of long-running joke with a former colleague of mine at a huge global media organization saying, hey, like, you guys really need to get on top of this UAP story because I know that institutionally they have absolutely no capacity to even acknowledge the story's real, let alone cover it or do the story any kind of justice. And at the same time, it's starting to erupt out of these official channels, which makes it unignorable. Whether it's on the front page of the New York Times or the subject of congressional inquiry. But it's obvious that model of journalism is simply incapable of integrating, like, as Layman said, this kind of extrusion of the other into our familiar experience or our familiar reality. So I love this idea of developing a more meta modern or more kind of quantum version of journalism, which is capable of reckoning with these metaphysical type experiences. I mean, I guess that's partly what is driving my own career, such as it is at the moment, or my own walking question. But I would love to think more about what it would mean for the media to actually begin to integrate this, because it's there's one or two journalists who work, conventional reporters, and I'm thinking of Leslie Keane in particular, who had a moment of recognition that this is real, and their entire careers changed direction at that point. And Leslie Keane made her name by getting that gun camera footage of the Tic Tac shot by the F-18s off the West Coast onto the front page of the New York Times. But that was after years, maybe decades, of essentially being in the wilderness, because there was no place for that story for a staff reporter on a conventional newspaper. So, yeah, I just appreciate you bringing in that question of how journalism and the media need to evolve in tandem with these revelations.
Just briefly here, I mean, I feel like there's something around objectivity and subjectivity that really becomes relevant when you're talking about this evolution of journalism, because like as Layman's work alludes to, like, your subjectivity is so directly involved in your capacity to describe and perceive these phenomena, to have a relationship with them at all. And yet journalism as kind of partner to scientific method is premised upon this notion of objectivity and like the erasure of the journalist as like really having a bearing on what they're reporting on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's always the idea is that the journalist occupies a view from nowhere, that we are somehow describing objective reality. And you made the link with the Western or the scientific method. So there's very much this idea that journalism is the handmaiden of this materialist, reductionist paradigm that we've inherited that doesn't allow much space for the kind of phenomenon that are being reported by reliable witnesses. So how do those two fit together? Well, the answer is they don't. And you can even see it in the reaction of colleagues. If I go into my former workplace and start talking about UFOs, people will laugh nervously, but they certainly won't take the story seriously. And that's partly why the disclosure movement is so intent on having an official endorsement of this narrative, because then it becomes impossible to ignore. But until that moment, even having somebody with the bona fides of David Grush, who was a very high level intelligence officer, who can tell Congress under oath that we have craft, we have bodies, and that is almost like a footnote in a in a write-up in The Guardian, rather than like global front page news, I think demonstrates the kind of gulf that we have to cross before the media will be capable of really contending seriously with this story, actually.
I'm also wondering.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing where you have these characters who we are willing to trust with almost anything, with our lives, right? If they say the missiles are on their way, or if they say there's a German U-boat, or if, right, these are the kinds of people who are our number one elite reporters and witnesses trained to be so. And yet, as soon as they say something outside of our normal world picture, we feel justified in ignoring it and throwing it away. Now, there's something you said a few minutes ago, Matthew, that really struck me, which was, what other kinds of gatherings do we need, right? Where do we need to bring people together outside of just the engagement between activists and institutions? And I think there is a number of these, and they could overlap and be combined, but we need scientists to be free to explore this on their own terms. We need people to be gathering, to be proactive in the attempt to produce these experiences and the kinds of coherence effects that seem to accompany these things. We need people to be gathering to deal with the traumatic aspect of it. I have several friends who, they're undecided about the phenomenon. They've never experienced this stuff, but they've specialized in patients who have gone through this. And whatever you think about it, it's had real effects on people's lives that they need to either process or it will disturb them. And we need gatherings of our philosophers and our reality speculators to see what kind of a reality could incorporate this information. Now, there's one other kind of gathering that you've mentioned here, which is the gathering of the journalists. How do they stand collectively in front of this?
Yeah.
What would it be like to bring together, a handful of the people who've been persuaded that there is something here that they have to take seriously? And I also situate that into the broader situation of how unreliable information might be becoming in the world we currently inhabit. Right, we've entered into the time of deep fakes and an automated production of evidence. So there's a new emerging role for the journalist, which is to be the verifier of whether something is real at all. And how does that new emerging role fit into trying to ascertain the reality or the type of reality that seems to come in sideways to our realities?
Yeah, I would love to be part of that gathering. Although I'm from where the media stands now, at least in my experience, I still feel that it's probably a little way off. It's just the few individuals really who are leading on this in these large institutions due to some idiosyncratic arrangement of circumstances that has allowed them to develop a personal interest and then actually get stories published. I mean, there's the number of people in that position, you can almost count on the fingers of one hand or less, actually. But yeah, I love the idea of that kind of dialogue, because it feels to me like, in some ways, this phenomenon is a mirror. It's a mirror to where we are collectively. And of course, some individuals will be far more attuned to this kind of experience, but they are outliers as we are currently evolved. But is it the case that there needs to be some kind of collective evolutionary update that starts to land more broadly, that would actually then bring this other into a new kind of focus? Because you've spoken already about how we've been haunted by this presence that has manifested throughout time in all kinds of different forms through myths and folklore. There are, of course, the well-known similarities between like stories of the Fae in Ireland, abductions, strange children, missing time. All of these motifs repeat throughout cultures, throughout space and time. And yet, is there a kind of endpoint to this? Is there a telos? Is there somewhere all this is leading? And, you know, if you listen to some of the channels that I do, they'll tell you we're going to see craft hovering off the coast of major cities in 2027, which isn't that far off. Now, obviously, we have to retain our critical faculties in relation to those kinds of accounts. And yet, you know, we seem to be on the precipice of so many other tipping points, whether it's in the climate system, the biosphere, politically even. We're looking at the collapse of so much that we once took for granted. Like, who's to say we're not entering this kind of weirding where we will be talking about a craft sitting off the coast of New York or Los Angeles in 2 years' time?
It's really it's fascinating. Like Jacob was mentioning, the implicit weirdness that's built into the realities that we already enact
Yeah.
and demonstrate culturally. And I think for a lot of people, it is important to not consider that, right? There's a reason there are, shamans and witches and all those sorts of people, is that some people need to specialize that and other people need to just get to work and not be constantly troubled by the inherent strangeness of the real. But then how does the information accessed by those people contribute to the general consensus notion of reality such that we can collectively respond to it in intelligent and pragmatic ways? And then there's this additional question of, going forward with our new technologies, is there a consensus reality in the near future? Right? Like, it's one thing to look at the role of journalism. It's another thing to ask whether journalism, does it even exist in 10 years? Like, there's a tremendous sea change in terms of how we all think about reality and information going on. And that image, it really struck me when you said that about the kind of people who have always and are still forecasting the imminent, obvious revelation of a hidden order of reality. And feels like some of that is occurring, but those people also, just like the people who might be covering it up or who might be ignoring it, they have a tendency to simplify it, right? It'll just be there and we'll all just acknowledge it and it will become part of the fact of reality. But most of the encounters that seem to have been reported with this stuff suggest that it inherently disturbs our sense of what reality is, that it brings that element of the weird and the peculiar and the elusive forward. So I would be very suspicious about a simple narrative that said this thing is just going to be revealed and acknowledged. I would expect that when and if it happens, we'll be wandering around going, what the fuck was that?
Yeah, or like you in your experience, the CE5 protocol experience last year, seeing some light that would seem to prove that you have indeed summoned the craft, and then reacting with an astonishing lack of astonishment, which is such a common feature or signature of experiencer accounts, that you see something incredible and you just don't pick up your phone to take a picture of it. It just doesn't occur. Or you go back to bed after seeing something at the end of your bed, you know. So
It interferes with our ability
yeah,
to gauge what's familiar and plausible.
yeah, it's like we're looking at something like we're imagining a resolute, like you say, if I'm hearing you correctly, like we're imagining like there could be some kind of resolution to this, but this experience operates in a completely different, like in a totally different structure or a different ontology. It's like there's a bridge that cannot be crossed, because if we bring that object into our reality breaks apart, and we can no longer apply the usual tests about what is real or not real. It's like they're incompatible in some fundamental way, which means that revelation maybe can never happen in the way we might imagine or anticipate.
And I
If I'm
think that
hearing you
would
correctly.
continue to be the
Yeah.
case, even if there was some very substantial disclosures of a particular kind, right? If it
Mm,
turns out that several of the governments of the world have the bodies of the Zeta Reticulans or something like that, that's not going to take the weirdness away from the bulk of these experiences. It's
mm,
like, I don't know if you guys watched the TV show Lost. It was on some years ago, but there was this phenomenon where they would reveal the answer to a mystery and it would only lead to more mysteries every time,
mm,
right? I
mm,
think we can imagine a pretty obvious scenario where some kind of craft or some kind of body or some kind of technology becomes openly acknowledged as being non terrestrial, and instead of clarifying everything, it just leads to an endless amplification of the
mm,
uncertainty and the different positions on the
mm,
subject.
mm, mm. Yeah, because it's asking, like my intuition is that it's this phenomenon is asking something of us collectively. It's asking for a level of coherence that would enable us to land the update that would be required to interface reliably with whatever it is that is communicating with us in all these mysterious and disturbing ways. But we need to become like we as a, and I mean like we as a global society need to become a different kind of society for that to dock in some sense. Like it just cannot land amongst us or with us as we're currently, like with all our fragmentation and conflict and division. And then that may be a very idealistic and, you know, perhaps naive way of thinking about it, but I do have a sense that it's calling forth, that there's something being called forth through this long story of fascination, mystery, and all of the folklore and all the forms of folklore that have grown up around this phenomenon. There's something being asked of us that we feel sometimes as individuals, like we sense in our own personal relationship to the phenomenon, which for me has been one of feeling like veils have gradually been dissolving as I've had a clearer sense of what it is that we're really in relationship with, like and I can only call it a knowing. I can't give any more authority to it than my own subjective perception. And I'm not making any claim that I want anyone else to follow or buy into, but I have a relationship to it. My intuition based on that is that it'll only be when we're ready to have a kind of collective capacity to relate to whatever this is that it will unveil itself more comprehensively, shall we say.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that sensibility, right? And we
Mm,
can't know what the the objective Bayesian priors are on that being the case, but so many people feel a sense of not only the strangeness of this, but
mm.
the continuity of the strangeness of this with ancestral experience,
Yeah.
and the sense that there's an acceleration going on where the ordinary conditions of the world are starting to ramp up in a way that brings forward the kind of ontological flooding or basic reality strangeness that a few people have always associated with these kinds of experiences, right? We have now, AI is a very interesting thing. We're like, we now have an additional strange quasi-human intelligence in play in the system. And we turn on the news every day, and politics is no longer just an interesting power struggle or a way to manage society. It's constantly astonishing, right? Everybody every night goes, what the fuck is happening here? So it does seem subjectively and intersubjectively like there is an intensification of the peculiar and of the alien and of the strange and of the disrupted reality. Now, it may be that that is a description, a phenomenological description of a pathway towards a very intense experience of that kind that we need to get better at handling. Otherwise, it's going to be extremely traumatic and disruptive for us.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the psychedelic renaissance as well, converging into this, and the kind of relationship between entity encounters that people report, obviously through psychedelic trips, and how they converge and overlap with a lot of the entity reports that come from experiencers who are just sitting in their back garden seeing these things, or in their bedrooms at night as they dissolve through the wall. And it does feel to me like we're living in a very, very different time to where we were 10, 20 years ago. And that this phenomenon and the amplification of the phenomenon and the idea that it is becoming, like you said at the beginning, more and more almost acceptable, even respectable as a topic. It all seems like part of the same spiraling movement forward. But where it's leading us and what impact it will have is obviously the question. And I'm remembering now a beautiful short Substack essay written by Matt Cardan, the writer whose work I really love, who wrote a really beautiful piece about how we're kind of greeting all these reports from Congress and whistleblowers of the reality of the phenomenon with this kind of shrug, like we're in this kind of fog of so much extreme content to deal with, so much uncertainty, so much seems to be kind of morphing, collapsing, shifting, that there's just no way to like get a hold of these revelations. They're sort of sliding by us, when in an earlier time the equivalent news would have actually been something we could all have been talking about. It's just here. It's just another part of the harm of the chaos that is rising all around us. And that's why I think it's important that like we're having this conversation. Other groups and people and networks are also contending with this, because like if it does amp up to another level, then I think like that phrase ontological shock suddenly gains a kind of salience, and we need to be like anticipating that.
Yeah, I see so much of that in the political discussions too, right? Like, I have so many friends in the United States, and you hear constantly from them their distress and their turmoil and their confusion around the Trump administration. But you can imagine someday, not too far into the future, where they're saying, oh, I remember the good old days when Trump was the president. At least he was human. Or, like what would be, if this trajectory continues, the things that we think are barely comprehensible today will seem nostalgic and familiar compared to the strangeness that might be awaiting us. And that's something that we have to be somewhat playful and resilient in order to encounter and surf with, but we can't handle it blithely because it can be extremely disruptive to people. And in some ways, they're almost lucky that these kinds of disclosures are buried in the sea of every other kind of cultural information chaos that's around us. Because if it really confronted people, how many of them would be prepared for that confrontation?
I want to bring in also, a couple of kind of philosophical grandfathers. For me, David Bohm and also Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, both of whom, in their own way, speak towards this kind of wholeness. Bohm's Implica Order, Teilhard's entire philosophy is woven with this sense that there's a wholeness in all of this, and that's what I was hearing and what Matthew was suggesting. Is like, what does it mean for us to treat all of these as part of the same whole? Like psychedelic renaissance, UFO ingression, weird Christic revival, planetary biospheric collapse, just trying to get on with everyday life and make money from an attention economy, like
AI,
all of these, the
yeah.
absurdity of that, plus AI, which I really appreciate you bringing in, Layman. And then I'm wondering about what you kind of alluded to of like the sense that there have been shamanic authorities or figures in each given society who maybe their role is assigned to go and tap into these realms and download things. And then there's a sense of how to appropriately land that within the community. And is there some kind of shamanic council, or like, is there some indigenous coded elder shamanic council that is formed, obviously not one, but probably a multitude of distributed councils, but some sort of formulation of social holding that is properly planted both in like a rooted way in the community and also in a rooted way in the shamanic and the realm of the other, and the capacity to navigate those realms, and that something like that is where we can begin to approach the possibility of holding all those things in a wholeness.
Yeah, this is a real passion of mine, because I think in addition to, political and military disclosure and scientific investigation that has to become more prominent, and a revival of new kinds of journalism, there does have to be something like it's complex. You have to be able to find the people who might be instinctively, let's say, neurogenetically disposed toward this kind of material. But that doesn't mean they're going to be healthy or smart or good at doing it. So, right, you have to be able to support them and be able to challenge them and start to figure out what the trainings would be, because the trainings might have something in common with traditional, archaic, and indigenous models, or it might be somewhat different. So we have to be able to figure that out. What would it take to mature and develop the skill sets of these people and interlink these networks or these hubs of people, these councils you're talking about? And then what does it take for their input to have bearing on what the rest of the civilization is doing? They have to have some kind of status or significance to the rest of the population, right? And in a way, that's an echo of the old tribal model, in which it did operate somewhat like that, but it would look quite different when we try to do it at the planetary and nation state level. So I think that that's an enormous project, but it is something we can begin to think about how we help with.
That was certainly not a career pathway that the teacher at the careers fair at my school had on offer, but one which, if it had been available, I would have definitely signed up for. Maybe my daughter, who's now 8, by the time she's ready to graduate, will be able to apply to work in this new industry that is emerging. I mean, it would be pretty incredible to create this global lattice of councils and practitioners who are actually dialed into this phenomenon and starting to allow that dialogue, or like what you've called in the past, Jacob, the interdimensional dialogos, to really start to cook.
Yeah. And also sensing in that you would want that to be a sort of X-Men like formulation. Like you wouldn't want just like it seems to me part of the problem of this is like get all the people who are super fascinated with UFOs and have them be the formulation of the UFO Council. It seems to me for the wholeness you need the guy, you need the Shipibo 40-year Shipibo ayahuasca shaman. Somewhere maybe there's a priest in there, somewhat more like a physicist, and sort of like in those Independence Day and movies like that, often these kind of things happen. But the pulling together of that multifaceted team that's kind of holding different parts of the wholeness through which that thing can be filtered.
Yeah, I think that's essential for looking at this at what we might call the planetary scale, right? Like we look at these characters who dealt with these kinds of realities and entities historically, you've got one or two in your tribe, but your tribe doesn't have a full sense of what the possibilities of this intelligence or these characters or this skill set could be. If we're looking at it at the global stage, we would say, oh, there's a whole bunch of different ways this could show up. And in no one particular lineage or tribe is necessarily going to know that. So we need to be able to be meta shamanic in the sense of, who do we need? Right? Where does the skill set show up in science? Where does it show up in Catholicism? Where does it show up among the ayahuascas? And which of those people are not only interested, but we think humanly mature and responsible, and also bring something interesting to that discussion if we were going to imagine, assembling the Avengers for this.
I feel like we're at the Council of Elrond right now, so yeah, I'm inclined to also let this really be a part one and leave the audience with some suspense. So I don't want to give away too much more of what's going to be involved in the formulation and induction into such a fine fellowship. But you have any further thoughts on that, Matthew, and also wonder if there's anything else that feels really important to plug in here. I feel like we've really done a good job of giving people a kind of foundation to begin to step into this terrain.
Yeah, I really love this vision of this global, what a true global response to this phenomenon could actually look like. Like an attuned response from humanity to whatever this is, or whatever these different phenomena represent. But yeah, and the media would be part of that. The kind of healing circles that we've spoken about will be part of that. Like, we could begin to really constellate a structure or network that will be capable of responding in a way that could draw this phenomenon forth, perhaps in new ways. So that's a really exciting vision to end on, not something that I anticipated at the start of this conversation. And yeah, I would definitely look forward to diving deeper on all of these strands. So thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Also, shout out to the artists. Definitely need the artists, as Terence McKenna would definitely be calling out right now, like to land something like this through paint and sound. Any last words from you on this, Layman?
Well, I'm glad you gave Terence a shout out. He was one of my boyhood heroes in trying to weave these discourses together and really appreciate all kinds of the strange elements at the edge of our reality field. I think there's a lot of possibility for us to go deeper into details, both in terms of what facts we're looking at, which elements of disclosure are viable, what we think the actual categories of this phenomenon might be, and how we would approach it, all that kind of stuff. But I think my last thought is just to consider this as part of a general sense-making revolution. Right? Sense making can be a wishy-washy term, but it also means something very important, which is we're understanding now that we cannot rely on a lot of traditional and modern methods for figuring out what reality consists of. But we know we have to do that, or we'll go insane and lose touch with the basic elements that make civilization functional. And we know that involves harnessing collective sapience somehow, that no one of us can figure out the answer. So we need to be figuring out how we engage in some kind of collective response to the question of what is the real. And this is an important subset of that inquiry.
Wonderfully put. Thank you, Layman. Thank you, Matthew. It was great to have you both on the channel today.
Thank you.
Beautiful. This was fabulous.